Hello everyone, it's lovely to see you. And I'm so pleased that you've been able to come. My name is Lisa Jackson-Pulver. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Indigenous Strategy and Services here at the University of Sydney. As is our way, we always pay respects to country. So tonight we have the great joy and honour of having none other than Uncle Chicka Madden to come and welcome us to country. So please join me in welcoming Uncle Chicka to the podium.
Good evening, folks. My name is Charles Madden, but known around the inner city of Sydney as Chicka. Now, that's a nickname that I got many, many years ago going to Redfern Public School, which is now NCIE, the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence. Folks, I'm from Gadigal land, Aboriginal land. That's the land we're on at the moment. For many, many years, I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I've been involved with quite a few Aboriginal organisations over the years. I've been a director with the Aboriginal Medical Service at Redfern for over 40 years. Also a director with the Redfern Aboriginal Housing Company, Aboriginal Hostels Australia, and the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. I've got to mention it, folks. Also, a life member of the Redfern All Blacks Rugby League Football Club. Hey. Thank you. Folks, for many, many years I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I'd like to take this opportunity this afternoon to extend a warm and sincere welcome to all of my Aboriginal brothers and sisters, non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters. If we have any brothers and sisters here from the Torres Strait or further afar across the seas, welcome. Welcome to Gadigal land. The Gadigal clan is one of 29 that makes up the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bordered by 3 distinctive landmarks. We have the Hawkesbury River to the north, the Peen to the west, and the Georges River to the south. Those 3 rivers form the boundaries of the Eora Nation. Folks, if you've travelled across this great city of ours today, the state of this great country, or from afar, welcome. Welcome to Gadigal land. Enjoy your stay. Have a safe and trouble-free trip home. Once again, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you. Enjoy the evening, folks. Thank you.
I always feel as though we are going to have a good event when Uncle Chicka welcomes us to his country. And I would also like to lend my respects to you and to your people and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as all of you who are here today, part of this wonderful nation, part of who we are as a nation, and our desire to learn so very, very much more about this land. This land has been a continuous source of learning and knowledge. I don't know, my grandmother used to say since time began. Others say 60,000 years or more. But tonight we will be contributing to some of the knowledge of that history with this 2023 Arthur and Hilda Winch lecture in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Pre-European Settlement Lecture. This is the 4th year we've had the privilege and pleasure of being able to put this on, with many, many thanks and love and respect to the Winch family. Topics that we've had in previous years include astronomical knowledge and the traditions of first astronomers of this land, of salt and of fresh water. Tonight, we're going to be taking an amazing journey into pre-colonial trade in the top end of Australia, where we'll also unravel the intricacies of these vast and enduring trade networks. It's with immense gratitude I welcome our esteemed panel of lecturers, Distinguished Professor Paul Tassin, Professor Lynette Russell, Dr. Darryl Wesley and Professor Sally May. Thank you so much for coming tonight and being with us. I would also like to thank the generous contributions from the Winch family that enables this lecture year in, year out. Their family's invaluable support empowers our institution to continue its tradition and dedication to preserving and sharing the rich tapestry of knowledge that shapes our nation. It shapes our nation's diverse cultural landscape and allows us to have conversations easily about what this place is and what it means. I've had many personal conversations with Mr. Winch over his times with us, and his commitment to this lecture series is deeply rooted in his belief in the wisdom held by older generations and certainly by the wisdom that's held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other ancient cultures. He supports and understands the immense value of these teachings and what these offer our modern world, especially within the cultural richness of what this nation is, Australia. I will not be your MC tonight. In fact, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Amy Mosigway, who will be our esteemed MC tonight. Dr. Way is a distinguished research archaeologist. She holds multiple joint affiliations, and if I was to read out her CV, we would be here for a very long time. But she's with the Australian Museum, the University of Sydney. She specialises in high-resolution stone artefact analysis. She works closely with First Nations community to explore past human behaviours and is actively involved in many a community research project. We're deeply grateful for your presence tonight, and I'm really pleased that you're going to be guiding us through this wonderful tapestry that we'll learn about tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Way.
Well, thank you, Uncle Chika, for that very warm and sincere welcome to this evening. And I too would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And thank you also to Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver for that very lovely introduction. And welcome to you all here tonight for the 2023 Arthur and Hilda Winch Lecture in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Cultures Pre-European Settlement. And I'd particularly like to welcome Ron and Elizabeth Winch and their families who are here tonight. So it's wonderful to be with you all and to be part of this year's Winch Lecture. As Lisa said, my name's Dr. Amy Mosigway, and I'm a research archaeologist who's jointly appointed between the Australian Museum and here at the University of Sydney. And my research is really with Indigenous communities, predominantly in New South Wales, to build deep cultural histories with those communities I work with. So this year's lecture is focusing on the topic of trade in the top end of Australia. And tonight you're very lucky because you're going to hear from 4 of the top academics who work in this space. So we have Professor Lynette Russell, Professor Paul Tayson, Associate Professor Sally Kate May, and Dr. Darryl Wesley. So they're going to share their research and their insights into this really fascinating topic. But before we hear from our colleagues, we're going to start this evening with an introduction video. And so this was produced actually by the team who's here tonight, the DVC Indigenous Strategies and Services Media Production team. And this video is going to give you a nice background to this context, to this topic, and really contextualise the research. So we'll start with that video.
Hello, my name's Dr. Amy Mosigway. I'm a research archaeologist and hold a joint position between the Australian Museum and the University of Sydney. Before we begin, it is with deep respect I would like to start by acknowledging the land we are on today, Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I recognise and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise this as a place of continuous learning and knowledge exchange for thousands of years. This learning continues today and is the reason we have the annual Winch Lecture. This lecture was first established by the University of Sydney in 2020, and each year it is made possible by the generous contribution from Ron Winch and the esteemed Winch family. This year's theme will focus on trade in the top end of Australia, including trade with the Macassans. This topic will explore the extensive history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander trade and connections, both within this vast landmass and across the seas. You will hear from our distinguished academics, the Professors Paul Tayson, Lynette Russell, Darryl Wesley, and Associate Professor Sally Kate May, who each bring their expertise to the forefront of our discussion today. But before we begin, let's start to unveil the intricate network of exchanges and interactions which have contributed to the rich tapestry of Indigenous cultures and societies over the millennia. Associate Professor Sally May will later speak to the antiquity of contact and explore the contact made in northwestern Arnhem Land. In the meantime, I would like to share one of the great untold stories of our country's past, how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples established a thriving network of national and international trade markets. Well before colonisation and the arrival of British fleets upon the shores, Aboriginal people in northern Australia were trading with the Macassans of Sulawesi and sending Australian produce into China for over 300 years. It's the establishment of these trade relationships and participation in international markets that contradicts the previously widely held theory that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were isolated from the rest of the world until the arrival of the British. One of the first major export industries in Australia was trepang, a soft-bodied marine animal. These sea creatures are highly prized in China, used as a medicinal product, and are considered a delicacy. In the 1600s, the demand in China rose for trepang, and this drove Macassan trepang traders into northern Australia and enabled these communities to establish connections in this large international network. Professor Lynette Russell will discuss how Aboriginal trade with the Macassans, a long-standing relationship established before 1600, was booming in the 1700s and extending well into the colonial period. It wasn't until 1907 that Macassan entry into Australian waters was prohibited. While these international trading routes were taking shape across the seas, there was, of course, an extensive trade network within Australia, which allowed for items to be traded across the continent. These networks stretched across the country, up the north and south coasts, branching off into the east and west. Archaeologist Darryl Wesley will share the many traditional elements of trade and explore the key trade networks across the Northern Territory. Distinguished Professor Paul Tayson will also guide us through the fascinating world of rock art, Aboriginal voyaging and trade in pre-colonial and early colonial times in northwestern Arnhem Land. Of course, there was also a vast number of trade routes and trading sites across Sydney and the lands the University of Sydney sit on, Gadigal land. Oral histories, which have been preserved through a series of texts by William Dawes, describe several trading and sit-down spots across the Camperdown Darling campus. These meeting areas were vital to the Gadigal people and the business they conducted with surrounding clans. Now it's time to hear from our guest lecturers and look further into this fascinating topic. You will hear firsthand as our lecturers share their invaluable research insights and knowledge as it relates to their own areas of expertise. It has been a pleasure to introduce the topic of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander trade to you. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. So, it's my pleasure now to introduce Associate Professor Sally Kate May. So Sally's an Australian Research Council Future Fellow with the School of Humanities at the University of Adelaide, and her research is really on exploring the lives of Western Arnhem Land rock art artists. So I'll hand over now to Sally. Thank you.
It's nice when the technology works. I hope I'm loud enough. Can everyone hear me down the back? I'm getting thumbs up, that's a good sign. I'm delighted to be here tonight, presenting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And each of the presenters here tonight, on behalf of all of us, would like to acknowledge the Winch family as well for their contribution and for their work supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history and heritage. And while we're thanking people, I'd also like to thank the organisers tonight who put an enormous amount of work into this evening, including Amy Stevenson, Amy Way, Roxy Burns, Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver, and the media production team as well at the University of Sydney. So thank you for planning this evening's events. Tonight we aim to take you on a journey, a broad-ranging journey that crosses oceans and centuries. And as the introductory video has demonstrated, tonight is about that long connection between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and ocean-going traders from countries to the north. Despite vast evidence for these ongoing relationships existing before European contact or settlement in Australia, most Australians, most in general public Australians, know very little about this particular history. And before I change the slide, I just want to take a minute and talk about this image. This is a print of an artwork created by artist Louis Le Breton while he was travelling with Captain de Ville, I think it was. And they visited Raffles Bay, which is on the Coburg Peninsula, in March and April of 1839. And during their stay, they made contact with the Macassan fleet, as they called it, even visiting their encampment. And this image is the artist's impression of their visit to this Trepang processing encampment. And it's a village brimming with activity and interaction between local Aboriginal people and visitors to their shore. Now, this image alone illustrates the complex long-term trade networks operating in Northern Australia. And for any people that are interested in botany in the audience, have a look at the age of the tamarind tree depicted in the middle here. And of course, tamarind was brought over by the Macassans. So pre-colonial trade in Northern Australia is not something that can be easily summarised, even by the four presenters here today, as the nature of these trade relationships varied across this vast coastline. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have different cultural memories of these histories, and other evidence from archaeology, linguistics, anthropology and historical research supports the idea of a diverse range of interactions between communities and traders. But we do know that the north of Australia was being visited on a regular basis and that these traders came across the open ocean from the north. We also know that far from the generally accepted notion of an isolated shoreline, the north was actually teeming with watercraft and crew engaged in trade for hundreds of years before European settlements in the region. The visitors we know the most about are the so-called Macassans, and of course they're referred to as Macassans because most of their ships appear to have come from the port of Makassar in Indonesia. So we'll continue with that terminology tonight. The crews, however, were said to have been multicultural. And the maps that you can see here demonstrate the extent of the trade routes connecting Northern Australia with Indonesia. And as was pointed out in the video to start, a lot of the materials collected in Australia were traded all the way up to China. Now, the timing of these visits has been hotly debated. And you'll hear more about this from the other speakers tonight as well. But from at least the mid-17th century until around about 1906, large numbers of sailors from Southeast Asia made these seasonal visits to the coast of Northern Australia and surrounding islands. And there is a strong case for visitation before the 17th century, including oral histories and also photographs. Let me go back. There's oral histories suggesting pre-Macassan visitation by visitors such as Baini, they're also known by other names, who were thought to be associated with whale hunting as well. So the large-scale trade, which is mostly what people are talking about when they refer to the Macassans, is strongly argued by historians to date from the mid-17th century. So pre-Macassans and then Macassans, and I think the other speakers will fill in some gaps there as well later on. Macassans made these annual journeys in vessels known as prow, and you can see a depiction of one on the left there. Characteristic tripod masts and deck structures, which for rock art researchers makes them very easy to identify in rock art. And they used the winds to guide their journeys. When the winds changed, it was time to go home. And interestingly, artists on Groote Island in the early to mid-1900s would still paint these winds, the winds that had names and clan affiliations, and they would paint them alongside images of prow and their crew. So these visitors engaged with Aboriginal communities, and Aboriginal people are known to have travelled back to Makassar with the visitors on occasion. We know this from oral histories, and we also know this from photographic evidence, as you can see here. A picture from 1873 taken in Makassar, Indonesia, and it's featuring Aboriginal people from somewhere in Arnhem Land. The jury's still out on that one. We're not entirely sure where they're from, but somewhere in Arnhem Land. So these early traders were here primarily to harvest trepang, also known as sea slug, but they also traded many other materials such as turtle shell, ironwood and beeswax. Why would you sail all the way to Australia and not take advantage of the diverse resources that were available along the north coast? And Aboriginal people were participants in this cycle of trade. They received material goods in exchange for their work in the industry, and presumably they also received goods in return for allowing the traders to work and live on their country for extended periods of time. And the trade, as I said, was certainly not one way. Aboriginal people received an array of materials in return, including things such as canoes, sails, tobacco, beads, metal knives, fish hooks, cloths, smoking pipes, etc. And again, you'll hear more about this later on from the other presenters. And there was also an extensive trade network involving Macassan material culture, so Aboriginal groups trading these items amongst themselves. And anthropologist Ronald Burnt found that in northwestern Arnhem Land, where I work, particular language groups actually controlled the trade in material culture from Macassar, and these groups being the Iwaja and the Hmong speakers. It's worth pausing here for a moment to reflect on what we know of the relationship between Aboriginal people and Macassans in Northern Australia. And this relationship has been relatively well documented for the northeast of Arnhem Land. There's been a lot more research in that particular area, and it shows a profound connection existed. We know less about other parts of Australia, especially areas such as the Kimberley, where we know very little, but also northwestern Arnhem Land, where there's new research happening. But there are clues for these other areas. For example, in 1952, the photographer Axel Poignant visited Goulburn Island and encountered an old man who had worked with the Macassans and had visited and returned from Macassar. In 1952, this man could still sing Macassan songs, such as Hoisting the Mast, Pulling the Line and the Rowing Song. And similar stories were recorded from Port Essington in the 1830s and 1840s, which indicate, again, frequent and lasting interactions. There's been an array of researchers who have contributed to our understanding of the impact of these relationships, but they've not always agreed, and they still don't agree today. So, for example, American anthropologist Lloyd Warner wrote, with the exception of the canoe, sail, mast, tobacco, pipe, Malay beard and tamarind tree, little else was contributed by the traders as a permanent part of culture. But others, such as Donald Thompson, disagreed with Warner's conservative ideas, arguing that Macassan culture had had a tremendous impact on Aboriginal communities, including their languages and ceremony. And this has been demonstrated time and time again across Arnhem Land. So, for example, linguist Nicholas Evans documented over 1,000 Macassan, Malay, Dutch words in Aboriginal languages. And he himself argued that this seemed to have been incorporated during a period starting really in the 17th century. And like linguists, archaeologists argue for longer chronologies of contact that involve both pre-Macassan and Macassan. For example, Paul Tason will talk to you in a moment about rock art evidence and other historical evidence as well. And you'll also hear from Darryl Wesley, whose archaeological research in northwestern Arnhem Land has rewritten our understanding of Macassan contact in this region. And their team didn't just excavate artefacts, they actually excavated Macassan burials as well. So, and of course there's University of Adelaide archaeologist Annie Clark, who's been arguing for well over a decade that visits were much earlier than proposed, based on her archaeological work on Groote Eylandt. So these interactions had a profound impact on both cultures, leaving legacies that continue today. As I mentioned earlier, we know little about the differences in cross-cultural relationships with different Aboriginal groups. Should we assume, for example, that the kind of relationships occurring in northeast Arnhem Land are in any way representative of other parts of Australia? This is a big coastline, a very big area. It's only really been in the last decade, with increased attention being paid to Macassan history, that we're starting to gain meaningful insights into these differences. And this is a sketch by William Westall, who I think other people might be talking about tonight anyway, so I won't go into that. When I was discussing this presentation with some Aboriginal artists from Inyalak Arts in Goombalanya, they reminded me that connections across the sea are deeply embedded in cultural traditions of Arnhem Land. 40 years earlier, their grandfather, a famous artist and pictured here by the name of Mijao, had explained that the ancestral being who created the first people and gave them their language had come from Makassar. He said, and I'm summarising this quote, it's not his full words, Warramaragunji came from Makassar. She first stopped on Melville Island and put a lot of people there and told them to speak Wunnog. Then she crossed the sea again to Cape Croker at the northern tip of Croker Island, where she told the people whom she left behind to speak Margu. And from there she made her way across to Grant Island, where she told people to speak Ilga, and then crossed to the mainland. So Warramaragunji came out of the sea in an area he referred to as Malay Bay. Mijao, an Iwaja man, was born on Croker Island, and he recounted this story in the 1980s, just a short time before he passed away. And he was about 90 years old when he told this story. And interestingly, his Trepang hunter family members were photographed by the famous photographer Raiko in about 1910. And you might also note in that photo that Trepang hunters are all women, which isn't talked about much in the research. So Mijao's account reminds us that the trade relationship so commonly discussed in relation to Makassar is built upon a much more significant cultural connection. So important evidence for contact between Aboriginal people and outsiders in Arnhem Land comes from rock art. And I'd like to turn just briefly to such evidence now. And as I said, Professor Taison will expand on this in his later presentation. So since 2001, I've been part of teams conducting archaeological research in Arnhem Land, and this includes some of the places seen on the map here along the Coburg Peninsula. And this research was instigated by Aboriginal elder who I'll refer to as Lami because he's passed away now. And he wanted to better understand and interpret his histories for his own community and for the wider community. And the area is home to a number of different Aboriginal clan groups, including the Hmong, who are the traditional owners of the Namalidjbuk clan estate, where much of our own work has been undertaken. And much of our research is focused on the different kinds of cross-cultural interactions taking place between Aboriginal communities and outsiders into this area over hundreds of years. And some of the places that I've already mentioned and other presenters will also talk about are shown here: Gumbalanya, Anaroo Bay, where Darryl was excavating, Fort Wellington, Fort Dundas and Port Essington, the early British settlements. One of our findings from this research is that despite a much longer period of interaction with Southeast Asia, it is the European-related rock art, I should say, that significantly outnumbers any other subject matter at these sites, and we would argue throughout the region. In fact, in our study area, if we even just focus on one particular subject that's painted, that is sailing vessels, we see 50 European examples and just 6 prow. The issue that we were delving into is why Aboriginal artists in this part of the top end were rarely depicting imagery associated with Southeast Asia, given the much, much longer period of interaction that's occurred. And Aboriginal community members were guiding us to look at contemporary art and contemporary relationships with rock art and other forms of art in search of interpretations. This is an image from Malarak, the site called Malarak, up in the Wellington Range, on the, kind of at the bottom of the Coburg Peninsula of a Macassan prow. In the early 2000s, I spent several years living in Gumbalanya and recording stories associated with art. And many of the artists painted on bark, and it's said that this medium owes its origins to the sketches on the inside of bark shelters that they would make in the wet season, just as they would paint the inside of a rock shelter they were staying in. So the earliest collection of paintings on bark were formed by explorers who simply removed sheets from shelters, and later they were commissioned by collectors. As well as providing an opportunity to exchange artworks for trade items such as tobacco, it's clear that these bark paintings served another purpose: their ability to serve as a tool for the artists to explain or teach their culture to their own people and to outsiders. As anthropologist Ronald Berndt in the 1940s records, he says, "I was learning about the country and its religious associations as manifested through myth, ritual and song. On their own initiative, the men who were explaining such matters to me undertook the task of representing what they were telling me in another dimension by painting on bark." And particularly in reference to his northwestern Arnhem Land fieldwork, the anthropologist suggested the artist depicted what they were talking about as a way of underlining its veracity. So the idea of art creation as a tool for educating is now well established. Elder Thompson Yilajuri, pictured here, explained to me that the bark was used to build shelters during the rainy season, and in the same way as rock shelters, the insides were often painted. He explained the purpose of these paintings was education, using painting to illustrate stories about life and beliefs and to teach children about culture. So how does all this relate to, all this ethnographic information really relate to Macassan Aboriginal trade networks? Well, it's clear that European sailing vessels were quickly and extensively painted in rock shelters from the earliest contact until recent years. And this assemblage is likely related to education, so informing members of your clan group and others about your interactions with the British and other settlers in the area. Yet there's an interesting possibility that emerges if we assume an educational role for rock art. Where's all the Macassan rock art? You know, there is some, but compared to the British, it's very little. As I said, in our study area, 50 paintings of European watercraft versus 6 prow. Did Aboriginal artists not need to communicate information relating to Macassan visits in this particular region? And you could assume a conservation issue, but rock art in this region has lasted for thousands of years. We've no reason to believe it wouldn't survive. Unless these interactions were occurring at a significantly earlier than assumed period. And unless there was no real immediate contact period, but an ongoing normative relationship between people in this region and Southeast Asia over thousands of years. In this case, contact period rock art appears to support the argument for a longer period of contact between Australia and Southeast Asia. And due to these long time spans of interactions and the fact that Macassans had become an integrated part of Aboriginal culture, if you like, the need to communicate their presence, warn family and so forth, was, and use it as an educational tool, was diminished. Evidence for pre-contact trade in Northern Australia is ever growing. To better understand this history requires Aboriginal community-led research and interdisciplinary teams. And you will hear some examples of this tonight. The rock art example I've mentioned briefly here demonstrates that these encounters were complex, but they were also regionally diverse. It's exciting to think about the new evidence that will emerge in coming years relating to Aboriginal Australia and their role in this international trade network prior to European settlement. It has been a pleasure being the first speaker here tonight, and at this point I'm going to hand over to archaeologist Darryl Wesley to continue the story.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests, Gadigal traditional owners and Eora clan groups. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you here this evening, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to do so. I would like to start with asking for a little bit of an indulgence with a brief prologue about how I started researching the archaeology of Indigenous engagement with Macassans and Europeans in Arnhem Land. And it all began in 1998, whilst undertaking mineral exploration surveys for the Northern Land Council with Mr. Lummy, who Sally referred to before, who was a mentor and guide and friend to all of us, who introduced me to the now famous Jewellery rock art site in Wellington Range. I hadn't ever expected to see this amazing rock art gallery, which was featured in George Chalupka's book, Journey in Time. And this was the beginning of what has turned out to be an amazing journey of discovery and collaboration with the Maung traditional owners and with my colleagues here tonight. And I can't thank the traditional owners of Western Arnhem Land enough for their generosity, collaboration, and welcoming us onto their country to research the amazing history of these relationships between Indigenous communities and the Southeast Asian mariners known as Macassans. I'd like to start this evening, and I will be talking about how, looking at archaeology and trying to establishing Indigenous archaeology and systems and how that connects to what we're talking about in terms of the trade and exchange with Macassans. And it starts with Indigenous Australian archaeology, which many of you will know is a profound and intricate field and spans over 65,000 years of history, or from the beginning of time, as we have heard tonight, that encapsulating an enduring narrative of one of the oldest continuous cultures on the planet. And I'm going to briefly delve into the rich tapestry of Indigenous Australian archaeology, emphasising the significant role research has played in unravelling and understanding the complexities of this engagement between Indigenous Australians and Macassans. Our journey this evening will explore how these archaeological findings not only offer insights into the past, but also illuminate the present and future of intercultural exchanges. These interactions are evidenced through archaeological discoveries such as trepang processing sites, Macassan artefacts, and rock art, which signify an early form of globalisation and intercultural trade. They also challenge the traditional narratives of isolation and serve as a testament to the sophisticated navigation and trading systems of Indigenous Australians. In essence, it is not just about looking back into history, it's about understanding how these ancient connections and the unbroken chain of Indigenous Australian heritage has shaped contemporary cultural exchanges and identity and their invaluable contribution to the global cultural mosaic. So it is important to note that there are extensive trade networks that Indigenous Australians developed over the past 65,000 years, as highlighted in the video and introduction that Amy presented earlier. Prior to external contact, a complex web of trade, exchange, and distribution routes crisscrossed the continent, facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas amongst diverse Indigenous groups. These networks, evident in archaeology, included the trade of valuable items like shell, ochre, stone tools, and ceremonial objects, reflecting a sophisticated system of exchange, demand sharing, and social interaction. There are many studies in Australia on trade and exchange networks, and illustrated here are just a few. On the shell trade networks as identified by Jane Baum and Sue O'Connor. Examples of sandstone grindstones produced at a site called Kuratiti in the Northern Territory and traded across the arid zones in Central Australia, as documented by Ken Mulvaney. The artefact distribution graph below shows 21,000 years of occupation at Maliwawa in the Wellington Range, and illustrates how stone raw materials were traded across hundreds of kilometres in Arnhem Land to end up in the site that we excavated. Intriguingly, these internal trade systems laid the groundwork for later interactions with external parties. The established routes and protocols for exchange became pivotal in the eventual interactions with Macassans and Europeans. Indigenous Australians' adeptness in trade and negotiation, honed over millennia, played a crucial role in these intercultural exchanges. Evidence of complex Indigenous social structures in Indigenous Australian archaeology is somewhat more challenging to demonstrate. However, there are many proxies in archaeology that reveal profound insights into past social systems. Archaeologists have documented innovations in Australian Pleistocene archaeology, such as the use of ochre, burials, ground edge axes, and grinding stone technologies. These archaeological proxies point to the presence of intricate social hierarchies and defined roles within Indigenous communities. Rock art has had a significant role in understanding social systems in Indigenous Australia. Archaic faces and other ancient motifs from the Burrup Peninsula indicate a deep time to social identity and connection to place. More recent motifs, such as the decorative hand motif shown here, hand painting, present very deeply personalised messages about clan group identity. Awanbana, shown in the bottom of the slide, the Hollow Mountain in Western Arnhem Land holds one of the largest mortuary complexes in Northern Australia, shared between many language groups and clan groups. These structures were pivotal in governing aspects of daily life from leadership to kinship and played a crucial role in trade and ceremonial practices. Significantly, These well-established social frameworks influence the way Indigenous Australians engaged in diplomatic relations with external traders. A prime example is from the Yolngu people and their idea of a two ways engagement and approach. This is an innovative method combining traditional Indigenous practices with external influences to foster effective communication and trade with Macassan traders and later with Europeans. We are afforded a glimpse into the rich ceremonial practices of Indigenous Australia in archaeology. We know that ceremonies played a vital role in Indigenous communities, serving as a conduit for cultural expression, social cohesion, and spiritual connection to country. Archaeological sites across Australia provide ample evidence of ancient ceremonies. Ceremonial sites in the form of stone arrangements and earthen mound complexes are ubiquitous in the archaeological landscape. In more recent times, rock art in the Kimberley, Arnhem Land, and the Burrup Peninsula depict intricate ceremonial gatherings or associated material culture. These artistic expressions provide invaluable insights into the cultural, spiritual life of Indigenous communities. And examples of Indigenous ceremonies are depicted in Arnhem Land rock art, as shown in this slide. When it came to engagement with external groups like the Macassans, these ceremonial practices played a crucial role. The Yolngu people, for instance, incorporated elements of their ceremonial practices in their interactions with Macassans, even adopting Allah as an ancestral being, facilitating mutual understanding and respect. Macassan motifs such as prows and anchors are made into sand sculptures for ceremony. The integration of ceremonial elements into external engagements exemplifies the adaptive and inclusive nature of Indigenous communities of Arnhem Land and highlighting their ability to maintain cultural integrity while engaging with other cultures. Australian archaeology also reveals a rich tapestry of a technological change and adaptation. Innovations in lithic technologies across Australia are pivotal to Indigenous life in Australia. For example, the use of heat treatment in stone tool production demonstrates an advanced understanding and manipulation of materials. Research at sites such as Mudgeberry in Arnhem Land revealed the use of early elaborate lithic technologies. This foundation of innovation significantly influenced the introduction and integration of new technologies brought by Macassans and later Europeans. The Macassans, interacting from the 17th century, which is somewhat, as Sally indicated, disputed by other researchers, introduced materials like metal, which were then adeptly incorporated into Indigenous practices. This is evident in archaeological sites where traditional lithic types, such as shovel-nosed spears, have been found modified with metal elements, showcasing an adaptive technological process and an approach which we are still yet to fully understand the production of metal shovel-nosed spears. Similarly, the use of glass and ceramics in the creation of new tool forms exemplifies a dynamic and innovative approach to technological change. These adaptations were not merely practical, they also represented a deep understanding of the material properties and a resilient approach to cultural exchange. The arrival of Europeans later further expanded this landscape, and Indigenous communities demonstrated remarkable adaptability, integrating metal tools into their traditional practices. It underscores how these Indigenous communities have continually adapted to integrated new technologies while maintaining a strong connection to traditional knowledge, showcasing a dynamic and resilient cultural heritage. Indigenous trade systems and networks underwent significant changes following engagement with Macassans. This contact brought about a radical shift by supercharging exchange networks in regions like Arnhem Land, and these systems were documented by early anthropological studies by Roland and Catherine Burnt and Donald Thompson. Archaeological evidence highlights the profound impact of these interactions. Prior to Macassan contact, Indigenous trade was largely characterised by the exchange of local resources like ochre, stone tools, ceremonial items. The arrival of the Macassans introduced a range of new goods such as textiles, ceramics, glass beads and metal tools, which became highly valued exchange items and led to the establishment of a new globalised trade route extending between Australia and to the Indonesian archipelago. Archaeological studies have also yielded extensive assemblages of worked glass, bottle fragments, metal objects, ceramics, and glass beads, often repurposed by Indigenous communities. And these artefacts serve as markers of change, indicating not just adoption of new goods, but also the remarkable adaptation of existing traditional technological knowledge to incorporating these foreign elements. The archaeology of Indigenous economies in Australia offers profound insights into subsistence practices over time, particularly in response to Macassan engagements. Research by Scott Mitchell, Annie Clark, and Pat Faulkner provide pivotal examples of how these interactions influence settlement patterns and subsistence techniques in the Northern Territory, Arnhem Land and Groote Eylandt. Prior to external contact, Indigenous subsistence economies were intricately adapted to local environments with practices like hunting, gathering and fishing using traditional knowledge, techniques and tools. Arrival of Macassans in northern regions like Arnhem Land introduced fishing technologies and practices. The archaeological evidence of this is seen in settlement patterns near coastal areas, indicating a shift towards more intensive marine resource exploitation. In Groote Eylandt, Annie Clark's research demonstrated that introduction of Macassan-influenced fishing techniques is evident in increased prevalence of fish species in the archaeological record. And Scott Mitchell highlighted how new materials such as harpoons and dugout canoes intensified the hunting of turtles and dugong. Research on Maung country, coming back to the Wellington Range and Arnhem Land at Anuru Bay and the Wellington Range, demonstrates major shifts in mobility and marine exploitation. There were significant changes in the marine exploitation in the contact era, as shown by the increased presence of shell-midden material at the site known as Malarak. At Anuru Bay, Macassan trepang processing site, we found significant differences in the distribution of shell species between the previous Indigenous occupation of the site over the last 1,000 years to that of the shell species present since Macassan trepang processing occupation. So Indigenous communities adapted to these new circumstances, incorporating useful aspects while maintaining core elements of their traditional economies and practices. So I'd like to conclude my portion of the evening's talk talking about a little bit about the overarching archaeology of Arnhem Land. So in conclusion, the extensive research in Arnhem Land over previous decades has significantly deepened our understanding of Indigenous Australian history, particularly in the context of intercultural exchange. Our archaeological studies have been instrumental in shedding light on the complexities and nuances of Indigenous Australian interactions with Macassans and Europeans. The meticulous analysis of rock art by my colleagues in the top end of Australia has provided vital insights into the cultural and spiritual life of Indigenous Australians, highlighting the rich artistic traditions and the significance of these artworks in storytelling and cultural transmission, arising from the engagement with Macassans and Europeans. Research on glass bead assemblages reveal the extent of the trade interactions with external groups, indicating a sophisticated network of exchange and communication externally and internally. Moreover, these studies on the impact of introduced materials like dugout canoes, textiles, iron tools, glass, ceramics, firearms and ships have offered a comprehensive view of how Indigenous Australians not only adapted but integrated these new technologies and items into their communities. There is a significant body of work contributed to by many through collaborative research that provides compelling evidence of this integration, showcasing the dynamic and resilient nature of Indigenous communities in the face of change. It is also important to note and acknowledge the contributions of collaborative work with the traditional owners who have not only enriched our understanding of Indigenous Australian history in Arnhem Land, but also emphasised the importance of archaeological research in comprehending the depth and breadth of Indigenous interactions with external cultures and the intricate and interconnected history of Indigenous Australians and the enduring cultural legacy. Thank you. I'd like to invite the distinguished Professor Paul Tayson to come up and speak to you about his extensive experiences.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you everyone, and welcome everyone this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to be back on Gadigal country. Before joining Griffith University, worked at the Australian Museum from 1991 to 2005 and spent a lot of time here at Sydney University during that period. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people, but also all of the traditional owners who I've worked with over the past 43 years, mainly across the Northern Territory, Queensland and New South Wales. So my focus is on trade during the 1600s to the 1800s in Northwest Arnhem Land, as evidenced not only by rock art, but also other artifacts, written archives, and European art. And there's been reference to Mr. Lamy Lamy, and I checked again, he sadly passed away 2.5 years ago, but I checked again with his family. It's fine to use his name and his photograph now because enough time has passed. And he was very generous with Sally, Daryl, myself, and many, many other researchers, sharing not only his knowledge and time, but his enthusiasm for his heritage. And he was always glad to work with researchers to pass on his heritage to other people and for it to be used for educational purposes. So Nemen Innsbruck in the Wellington Range is one of the areas that I'll be focusing on this evening. Also Owen Barna, whose country, the senior traditional owner from that country is Charlie Mangulda. He's now 90 years of age, but the beginning of October we did some field work together in an area that can only be reached at that time of the year because the floodplain has to dry out. It was 43 degrees. He was walking around, visiting rock shelters with me. If I can do that when I'm 90, I'll be thrilled. But the two of them have been very generous with all three of us and others, especially in terms of talking about the rock art. And I'll also be referring to Victoria settlement in Port Essington more generally, where there was this major European, British outpost for over 10 years. Many people have been mentioning rock art. That's one of my main areas of expertise. And rock art's all about encountering the visual past. So my PowerPoints are always highly visual. Probably I cram more photographs into mine than other people. But that's trying to get across to you that these sites are amazing. Some of them have thousands of paintings. And the Lamy Lamy family members all refer to rock art as history books. But really big sites like jewellery that's been referred to are libraries because there's just so much there. In the ancient and the recent past, Aboriginal people walked very long distances for ceremony, for painting, and for trade. And a good example of that is a rock and bark painter by the name of Naum Balmy from Western Arnhem Land. The yellow lines represent his walking route over an 1800 square kilometre area. And he painted at hundreds of sites along those routes. This is one site that I rediscovered in the mid-1980s. But he's one of the most prolific artists. But people routinely walked very long distances for trade prior to the arrival of the Europeans. But of course, First Nations Australians have been connected to other parts of the world for thousands of years. And a good example of that is the arrival of the dingo from Southeast Asia, sometime between 3,500 and 5,000 years ago. We have dingo remains dated to 3,500 years ago in the southern part of Australia. And it may well be that they arrived much earlier, but they didn't just swim across. They arrived on boats, and no doubt there was lots of trade and other things going on as part of that process. At least the 1600s to 1907, prows were very common in the waters of Northwest Arnhem Land. And as been mentioned by others, people came from Southeast Asia, from not only Macassar, but other areas as well, mainly in search of trepang or sea cucumber, and other forms of trade, some of which have been mentioned already, and I'll explore in more detail later. In the early 2000s, or sorry, it was late 2009, we sampled a beeswax snake. This snake was made with beeswax pellets. It was over top of a number of paintings, and we were able to use radiocarbon dating to date the snake. And the snake significantly was over a large painting in light yellow of a prow. It was a bit difficult to see in a photograph, so I've got two different enhancements of the prow. But the key thing is the minimum age of the snake dates it to 1664, which means the prow was made prior to that time. And that's the earliest evidence we have of a prow being in Northern Australia. Ronald Lammy-Lammy's grandfather's brother traveled to Macassar on a prow, and he stayed there. Many people traveled from the top end of the territory to Macassar, and Lynette will talk about that in more detail after I've finished. But lately I've been combing all sorts of archives, reading handwritten diaries, letters, ship's logs and journals to better understand the nature of trade with Europeans and Macassans. And the earliest that I've found in terms of a named individual traveling to Macassar and returning was Caraday, one of the Lammy's ancestors, and he went over to Macassar and came back in 1838. And we've got some reports from the early 1800s that at times over 1,000 people came from Macassar to Arnhem Land and the shores of Arnhem Land. They came in large fleets, but then they parted and went to different parts of the coast. People established relationships with different communities, and they returned to those same places year after year. So here in 1803, for instance, over 1,000 men were reported to have come from Macassar, or were a part of Macassar crews because they were quite multicultural. But again in 1829, over 1,000. So this wasn't something sporadic. The earliest account that I could find of Europe, of trade between Northwest Arnhem Land Aboriginal communities and Europeans goes back to 1705. And that's when the Dutch Van Delft expedition spent about a month in the Coburg Peninsula area. And some men came on board their ships, sometimes daily, and they traded fish and crabs for cloth, beads, knives, food, drink, and other things. So that's one of the earliest, but also when British first arrived to establish Fort Wellington and then Victoria Settlement, immediately people were getting on boats and trading all sorts of things. With Victoria Settlement, for instance, the ship the Essington arrived first. A couple of weeks later, the Alligator and the Britomart when the alligator arrived, they observed all of these people on board the Essington, dressed in European clothes, these Aboriginal people, and trading all sorts of things. And soon, a few months later, people were coming on board daily as the settlement was set up. So there was a great enthusiasm for trade. And Victoria Settlement itself became a multicultural trade outpost. And I'll just read this wonderful quote to emphasize that from Windsor Earl. And so he was there as part of the first group to set up Victoria Settlement, and in a couple publications he wrote, "Parties of warriors headed by their chiefs occasionally came from the remote interior," and that's important to note, "to pay us a flying visit. Nearly every Macassar prau that arrived from the Gulf of Carpentaria brought 2 or 3 individuals from one or other of the tribes that are distributed along the intermediate coast. Indeed, about the month of April, when the praus congregate at Port Essington, the population of the settlement became of a very motley character, for then Australians of perhaps a dozen different tribes might be seen mixed up with natives of Celebes and Sumbawa, Badjus of the coast of Borneo, Timorians and Javanese, with occasional sprinkling of New Guinea people." And a number of people noticed that it wasn't just trepang, but turtle shell was a very important trade item. So the Aboriginal community members would kill the turtle for their meat, but then they would especially save up the shell of the hawksbill for trade and exchange with the Macassans. In return, they received clothing, bamboo, rice, and canoes. But many of these things were then taken inland, where they were exchanged with inland tribes for spears, throwing sticks, and so forth. And here are some drawings by John MacArthur in 1847 of some of the visiting praus, and from one of the Namaninge book sites in the Wellington Range, this wonderful painting of a baddock, a knife from Macassar in its sheath. So the hawksbill, trade in hawksbill turtle was extremely lucrative. In 1839, 3 praus at Port Essington had what was estimated to be about 500 English pounds of tortoise shell. And in today's terms, that would be worth 63,967 pounds. So the trade in tortoise shell was as important, if not more important, than the sea cucumber. And there were many other groups that would receive the tortoise shell in exchange for other things. The Chinese were trading tortoise shell way back to 1100, but also some of the islands to the north of Australia. Tortoise shell was extremely important in Sumba, where they made these wonderful combs with all sorts of carved figures. Those were important for lots of ceremonies, weddings, funerals, and many others. But the key thing is that Aboriginal people were initially killing the turtles for meat, a very important food source, but then they were accumulating the tortoise shell for trade with Macassans. Many people have noted that, and as I was saying before, that when the people of Northwest Arnhem Land received goods from Macassans or then from Europeans, those were immediately traded inland. And people further inland would either come to the coast, or people from the coast would go inland, often for ceremony, and then people from the coast would receive spears, stone for stone tools, because stone is very rare on the Coburg Peninsula, ochre, and lots of other things. We did a bit of a visit in June this year, and on the coast found this silkon, this stone tool, and it likely came from the Kakadu National Park area. There's no stone like this, no tools on the Cobourg Peninsula like this. They were all traded in, over hundreds of kilometres. And as Sally said, that Ronald Burt noted that the people, the Waja people and the Hmong people on the coast had a monopoly in the trade of Macassan European material, which continued until recent times during ceremonies. And sometimes today at funerals, people bring cloth for the family, which is like the cloth that they received from Macassans. Now, just briefly, I'll show you a few photographs from some shelters in Alwan-Barna and Namaninchbuk, where we find not only fabulous rock art, but lots of evidence of trade. So at this particular site, Mayagu, also known as Artifact Cave, there are some wonderful paintings on the outside, but inside you go through a little bit of a passageway tunnel, and then there's like a cupboard with a really old domino, a little metal European box, but also a Macassan adze, which unfortunately is broken into two pieces. But that came from a part of the coast about 110 kilometers away. At another site, you arrive and you look at the amazing paintings on the ceiling, but then when you look down, there are all these beads on the floor. So this is known as the Blue Bead site. So one of the things that is really remarkable is when we go to these shelters, not only has the rock art survived, but also this old evidence of trade from between very different groups of people. In the letters and journals of the people that stayed, the British that stayed at Victoria Settlement, one of the things they noted was that metal objects were in high demand, not only Macassan, but also European objects, and that these were traded far inland. So metal was a very important trade item, not only to receive directly from Macassans and Europeans, but then that was a valuable thing to trade with other Aboriginal groups to receive artifacts from them. And not only do we find artifacts in the shelters, such as this old plate, a wonderful, very old fork, but also on the rock shelter walls, there's this amazing painting of a teacup and a coffee mug. This is a site that we relocated in 2009 that has quite a unique painting of a European vessel, because you can just see there's a crew member, there's a couple crew indicated, but one of them has a telescope, and that's the only painting that we know that shows someone using a telescope. And there was a group of Aboriginal people from this part of the Namaninchbuk area who were recruited, some people say kidnapped, but for pearling in the Torres Strait. And after a short while, the person, Cadell, the commander of the ship, who was notorious for treating his workers, Aboriginal and Malay, terribly badly, they mutinied and stole a couple canoes and came all the way back. But labour was traded since at least the early 1800s and possibly much further back in time. And something else that was traded was stories. Aboriginal people told stories of the encounters they had with these other groups of people inland, away from the coast, at rock art sites like this, and they made paintings like this as a part of that process to educate other people about the experiences they had, and also what to expect when you go to the coast. And I'd just like to end with a photograph or two of some of the art that we found in October. Charlie and I documented then a couple more paintings of ships that we hadn't known about before, and a sea turtle way inland. And probably these are all related to some of Charlie's ancestors going up to Victoria Settlement and coming back, but also people from the north coming down, because they were very closely related and shared all sorts of ceremonies to Charlie's country, Awan Barna, and telling stories of the adventures that they had with these curious new peoples, and leaving these images behind for future generations. Thank you. So I'll now pass on to Lynette.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the invitation to speak tonight. And thank you for that very warm welcome we received. And I also acknowledge traditional owners, but my colleagues and co-presenters. But I'd also like to acknowledge my wonderful colleagues in Macassar who I've been working with for the last few years. So my talk is going to be a little bit different because we're not focusing just so much on Northern Australia. I'm actually going to take us a little bit to the north. So we saw this photo earlier, or rather this painting earlier. This is Pobosso. Pobosso was a Macassan sailor who was encountered by Matthew Flinders, painted by Westall. Beautiful image, it's absolutely stunning. As he looks out to sea, seeing that wonderful storm on the horizon there. A lot of people think Pobosso might have been one of the very earliest people to come to Australia to trade. I suspect this is a misreading of the original translations. But Pobosso, like all of the Macassans, were actually part of the Dutch East Indies because Indonesia at that stage was very much under Dutch rule. And I think it's important that we remember that because that's a framing lens for all this discussion. I'm going to apologise in advance for any repetition. I'm going to suggest that it's not so much repetition as emphasis. So I want to ensure that the story of Pobosso and the story of the Macassans is known widely across Australia. As each of my colleagues have mentioned, it's still a relatively poorly known period of Australian history. There is a perception out there that Australia was isolated for tens of thousands of years and not very much happened, and then the Europeans bumped in to the east coast and suddenly we had Australia. Well, Pobosso, like his colleagues, Macassans, were very important. So I've actually just literally signed the contract to a Thames and Hudson illustrated children's book series, and our first book is going to be on the Macassans. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity tonight to think about how we talk about some of this material. So as we know, the Macassans came on the trade winds. They sailed out of the port of Macassar. They were almost certainly from multiple different ethnicities or cultural groups. My colleagues in Macassar assure me that they almost certainly would have had Chinese cooks. That's not something that people talk about very often, but Chinese cooks on these boats. And these were boats made up of men from various different communities, Bugis, Javanese, Balinese. Trepang at that stage was a global commodity. And the Macassans, as we call them, a shorthand really, a very loose shorthand for people who came out of the port of Macassar. The Macassans worked the Trepang grounds right across northern Australia. Quite often people don't include areas such as Torres Strait, and we've got no evidence that they were in Torres Strait, but we've certainly got some artefacts that have come from Southeast Asia that probably indicate at least some connections. These are just some of the sites that people were working. One of the other ways that we know about them, apart from the archaeology, is we know from 19th century images. And we've seen a few of these tonight. And as I said, not repetition, emphasis. These are very useful in showing us how complex the relationships were, because these demonstrate that Aboriginal people have allowed Macassans to park their processing plants, literally industrial-sized processing plants, on their land. And we know this because some communities, some groups refused, some groups said no. And we have stories particularly of the Tiwi, who for a very long time rejected the Macassans and only relatively late agreed to allow them to come and fish in their waters. As I say, treepang was a global commodity, and it was something that was traded, as you've already heard, right up into China. But we've actually uncovered something even more interesting quite recently, and that is that the word Vladivostok actually means sea cucumber. And we think that there's a really good chance that that trade extends beyond China up into North Korea and probably across to Russia. That is an astonishing thing if we think about Australia as being part of this trade, far from being isolated. It wasn't just Australia, it was also throughout the Pacific. There were certainly treepang activities throughout Polynesia and Melanesia, Vanuatu and Fiji. Recently, my colleagues and I have attempted to really rethink the chronology for the Macassan trade. And you will have heard we have the very early period, which some people call the Bayini period or the Baju period, the people who may have been whale hunters, people who were probably, as they are now called, sea gypsies. Well, our research suggests we suggest 4 phases for Macassan sites across northern Australia. The first era is that very early encounter period, and that is perhaps up to 1,000 years ago. The research project that I run is called Global Encounters, 1,000 Years of Interactions. I picked 1,000 years relatively randomly, and it seems to have been really kind of almost prescient, so very grateful for that. The first, that 1,000-year period is based on that very early date that we heard earlier before of Annie Clark, suggesting that she may have something around the 900-year mark. We then have a second phase, these are all postulates. These are not by any means solid, but these are what we're currently working on and thinking about. The next set is a set of voyaging entrepreneurs, voyagers from Southeast Asia, testing the waters, as it were, seeing what's out here, what's available, what can they be trading and exchanging. And there's a very interesting Southeast Asian ceramic sherd that was found in Torres Strait, which is one that I'm talking about as being a potential connecting all of these different trades. Our next phase is the phase that most people talk about. I would push it back a little bit earlier than 1750, but we're sort of stuck on 1750 at the moment because that's when we've got the really solid archaeological dates and we've got solid archival dates. That's when the treepang industry is documented by the written histories, particularly Dutch histories. As I said, Indonesia was the Dutch East Indies. This is when most of the trade is coming out of the port of Makassar. And Makassar, as we know at that stage, is a thriving port city. When the Dutch arrive, they build one of their magnificent star forts, which is still extremely well intact. And if you ever get the opportunity to go to Makassar, walking around the edges of that fort is just amazing. It's probably the most intact 17th century building in the Southern Hemisphere. The decline of the treepang industry really starts in the later part of the 19th century. And it's actually banned in around 1907. It's something to remember that this is actually part of the White Australia policy. That's why the the treepang industry is shut down because the Australian government did not want coloured people visiting. We would like to argue that the treepang industry, as it occurs in Australia, is in fact connected to the spice routes and the Silk Road. It is the southernmost, easternmost tip of that trade, but it is fundamentally part of a globalisation that's taking place in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. You won't find maps of the spice routes or the Silk Road that include Australia. You can see the shoulder of Western Australia in that photo, that image there, but you won't see much more than that. However, and here's one. This one's actually from the. This image is from the Singapore Museum of Asian Civilizations, and you've got the Moluccas, you've got the Spice Island, you've got all this amazing activity, and as you can see, absolutely nothing's happening in Australia. Even though we know thousands, potentially thousands of people over hundreds of years are trading in the waters of northern Australia and taking treepang back through Southeast Asia, China, possibly even up into Vladivostok and across who knows where from there. What's interesting is the Macassans themselves have no doubt that Australia is part of this trade network. This not very good photograph, I have to confess, is taken at Balalampur, which is a museum in Macassar. It celebrates Macassan history. And you will see the ghostly figure of Professor Ian McNiven there taking the photograph for me. Thank you, Ian. What you can't see very clearly is a dotted line that indicates the Indonesian kingdom of Goa, which doesn't merely take in Indonesia, it takes in a very significant chunk of northern Australia. People in Macassar were under no illusions that this trade was part of a global system that they considered, and we know that they called particularly the Arnhem Land region Marege. We know that they saw Macassar, the relationship between Macassar and Australia, as one of significant economic importance. I've recently come back from spending time with my wonderful colleagues in Macassar, and in particular, I got the opportunity to spend time with that man there in the white shirt, and he is the great-grandson of Dane Ranga, who was the last treepang fisherman to come to Australia in the early part of the 20th century. And he's desperately keen to keep alive the stories of the relationship between Aboriginal Australians in Northern Australia and Macassan fishermen, and the relationships that they had that were familial, they were religious, they were economic, they were ceremonial, and they were friendships built. As you know, we just mentioned before the image of the young Aboriginal men who were in Macassar for a number of years, or for significantly some time. And these people are remembered today, and they've recorded in the annals of the Macassan archives as well. There's a wonderful story of Charlie Dajari. He goes to Macassar and he says, near where I stayed in Macassar, several countrymen were living there. There was Jamuda from the English company who'd come to Macassar as a small boy. He'd worked there and he'd never returned home. And when I saw him, he was a grown man. He had married a Macassan woman and they had 4 sons and 4 daughters. And then there was Gadari, a man from Arnhem Bay. He had come as a young man and worked there and married a Macassan woman. When I met him, he was middle-aged and he had a lot of children. But I heard afterwards he had died. He had been married to an Aboriginal woman when he left, but he never came back. This indicates to me that Aboriginal people were very actively involved. There's a wonderful reference that in the Macassan State Archives that states You go to the port of Macassar, this is in the 19th century, and you will meet many Australians. I don't think they're talking about people, European Australians. They're talking about Aboriginal Australians. So, just this last one. This is the photo. This wonderful photo, as we heard before, taken in 1873 by Eduardo Beccari, was found by the extraordinary Professor Jane Lydon in the Pigarini Museum in Rome. I've just had the opportunity, as I said, to be in Macassar, and we took these photos with us, but we also hooked up with a community on Groote Island, and we talked to them. We did a little video exchange while I was in Macassar holding these photographs and talking to them. At the moment, it does seem that many people are claiming them as their ancestors. This is not uncommon. We know that because when people see photographs, they can't always be sure. But we do know without any doubt these are Aboriginal men and a young boy who have gone to Macassar, who've been photographed in Macassar, who may have ended up staying in Macassar, may have lived there for the rest of their lives, made lives for themselves. This says to me that what we have here is not a story of isolation. It's not a story of remote, unconnected, uncontacted Australian people. It's a story of mobility, entrepreneurialism, innovation. It's a story where Aboriginal people exerted their agency to the very best that they could, and they jumped on boats and they sailed off into the unknown. I already had covered similar experiences when I did a book a number of years ago on the maritime industry and Aboriginal men who worked as whalers, who literally just got on boats and went out into the Pacific and joined the whaling fleets. And I see the Macassans and the Macassan trade as an opportunity for us to rethink the relationship that we have with the way in which we depict our past. Australia was never isolated. It was never a sad, lonely place where nobody visited. We know that people visited, and the Macassans are merely one of many people who visited us for many, many hundreds of years. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. So that brings us to the end of the formal part of our evening, and I'd like very much to thank once again our distinguished guests, Sally, Daryl, Paul, Lynette, Uncle Chika and Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver, and of course the Winch family for their generous support which makes this lecture series possible.